collectors, and welcome back to the Life Burst podcast, where we're reviewing the new Elrigs coming out in Lost Storage. There's a bit of a gap between when I recorded this one and when I recorded the last couple. I got a very bad flu, so I'm back, but my voice might not be 100% there. We're going over Aya for this one. Aya is... I like that I had the flu for a little bit, because it allowed me some time to really, rack my brain over what kind of a build I really wanted to go with Aya. Aya is very strong, and I think could be very good in the meta, but I struggle with this this deck a little bit, and the reason why is Aya is very well represented over in Japan, and honestly, when I read Aya as an Elrig, I can understand why it's good, but I also don't understand why you wouldn't use something like Madoka or Umir or Tamago over Aya. I understand that Aya is a particularly people's favorite character, and so it might be sort of bloated in terms of how much it's used over there. In comparison to what, we might be doing a little bit more competitively over here in America. But it's an interesting deck. Plus it has access to coins, which make it a little bit weird too, because right now Blue's got the best coins as well. So it's do you utilize that? Do you not utilize that and use other strengths? It's a difficult call. But I think Aya is still very, very good. And I kind of built it towards one specific strength. But let's go over Aya herself before I talk about the whole deck as a whole. So Aya is a level 3 blue Elrig that when you play Aya as a level 0, you get 4 coins, and then as a level 3, you get 1 coin. So you get a total of 5. You're not really gaining access to any other more coins in the game, so this isn't like Rill, where you have unlimited coins. You do get a set amount of coins that you can use, and usually throughout a game, that number is going to be something like 2, 2, and 1. Aya is got the auto ability of whenever this Elrig attacks, you reveal the top card of your opponent's deck. If it's a level 1, do 1. Right, out of its couple things it does. If it's a level 2, do 2. If it's a level 3, do 1 or 2, your choice. And if it's a spell, then you get to do 1 and 2. So it punishes the opponents pretty hard for spells. 1 is draw a card. 2 is your opponent discards a card from their hand. Right? The dream is to hit a spell, because then it's basically better than the original Tamago. You get to make them discard a card, you draw a card. It's infinite potential, Let's dive back into that in 1 second. But you're also, once a game action abilities, you can target 1 signal on your opponent's field, turn it face down, and then the beginning of every attack phase. That includes the beginning of your attack phase and the beginning of your opponent's attack phase. If there's no signal on that field face down, the opponent may pay 2 or discard 2 cards from their hand. If they do, they can turn that face down card face up. Okay, so before we dive into the action ability, which I actually think is rather weak, but can be strong later or when you time it correctly, let's do that first part, which is when this Elrig attacks, you reveal the top card of your opponent's deck. Now, generally speaking, your opponent's going to have some kind of Signy divide of anywhere from 16 to 18 level 1 Signies, anywhere from 4 to 10 level 2 Signies, that's a big flexible one, anywhere from 8 to 12 level 3s, and anywhere from 0 to 6 spells. That's another big flexible one. The difference is, this is actually pretty good against specifically more of the controlling or longer term mid-range decks, right? Generally, those mid-ranger decks are going to have 10 level 2s. They're more proactive mid-range decks. They'll have 10 level 2s, and then 10 level 3s, as well as maybe 2 spells. Which is a lot, right? So that's already now half their deck is anywhere on the level 2 and higher slot, right? And if they're level their level, if they're more of a control deck, they're more likely to have less level 2s, but more level 3s, and also more spells, right? That's where you get to the 6 spells upwards sometimes. Um, Generally speaking, against those decks, right, that chance to hit their 6 spells is really nice, but it's still a low number. But they'll have a higher number of level 2 or level 3s because of it, which means that you'll be able to pick what's best for you. Do you need to draw a card, or do you need to make your opponent discard a card? Basically, are they grinding your hand down to nothing? Okay, then maybe you draw a card. Or is this a deck that you want to grind their hand down to nothing? Against the aggro decks, which generally speaking will have 18 level 1, so half their deck, 50% of the time you'll be flipping you'll be doing the number 1, which is draw a card, is usually pretty good against them as well, because that gets you closer to guards. And that helps you then inevitably win those games. Its once a game actionability is not really all that great when you realize that the opponent can just pay 2 enter, which is a very available resource, especially later as the game goes. Or discard 2 cards from their hand, which maybe some aggro decks don't mind necessarily doing, to basically flip their Signy back up. But it taxes them. Taxing them is pretty good. And it also is good against decks that are more longer game, that you're enter starving specifically. Because if you do that, then they don't have the enter to easily pay for this ability. So you might be able to smack this on turn 3 and get an extra damage. And blue struggles with getting damage output. So even having something as weak as this is actually quite good for it, especially because blue is the deck that can set itself up the best to enter deprive, especially blue-white, or it can make the opponent not have cards in hand. And that's what you're probably doing very early on with this deck, right? Your goal is probably going to be enter starve and make the opponent discard cards, so that way when you hit this on turn 3, you can pretty immediately use this ability to score in yourself an extra damage that you wouldn't normally be able to that game. Or you can wait. Now, the danger with waiting is against like a control deck or something. You can wait for this to be like, okay, now I have the victory here. Generally speaking, control decks will be able to refuel their hand or will have leftover enter. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll be playing something like Miasma Labyrinth, which costs 3, as well as trying to do Tamago's ability, which costs 2, and also be able to pay 2 to bring the guards back to their hand through Super Celestia Saber. So you end up with this scenario where they spend 8 enter in 1 turn. I don't think control players, a smart control player, will necessarily do that against Aya. And they'll break it off between a couple turns, so that way they don't allow this ability to become live. But the deck does support a lot of ways to enter deprive. So I think your best bet is to snap this off turn 3 or turn 4. With that in mind, when I started making the deck and looking at some of the amount that exists in Japan, and there's a variety of these that exist in Japan. There's some versions that like are more controlish. There's some versions that are more taxish. There's some versions that are mono blue that won a GP, or not won a GP, but got 2nd place, I think, in the GP. But all of them generally have one thing in common, which is on your opponent's turn, your opponent will never have cards. Like that's the goal. On the opponent's turn, you'll never have the opponent will never have cards, and you enter deny them. If you can do that, then you realize a lot of the things that this deck does, it just never really falls to control strategies, because the control strategies will try to limit what the opponent can do on their turn by destroying their hand, and Aya always has ways to refuel its hand. So that's sort of the idea that I played with. The idea that I played with this is that you are the ultimate tempo deck. That being said, you really don't play very well against aggro decks at all. That's going to be a weakness for this type of deck. But there's less and less aggro appearing now, which I think is wrong in the meta. I think aggro is still plenty strong, but I think there are less aggro overall, especially with the poll that we did recently on the channel, that I think there has been a bit more of a resurgence into mid-range, where you might have the time to be pulling off a ability like Aya pretty easily. So we talked about Aya a lot, right? We get coins. That's the other thing that we're going to need to talk about as we go through the deck. Let's talk about Aya's assists. The first one that I've got is Madoka Float, and then I followed up with Madoka Break. Now, You could use Madoka Dub instead of this. It would lower your enter costs significantly, which is pretty nice for this deck. But the deck is actually genuinely pretty free, like in terms of how much enter it spends outside of this. So I think it's okay to play Madoka Break. Now, Madoka Break basically lives or dies on whether or not you can play 5 enter for it. If you can't, it's really only pretty marginal. But blue, especially blue-white, really lacks ways to punch damage through. So Madoka Break is sort of the way that you keep up with holding an aggro push down while simultaneously allowing yourself to have a shot at winning for these longer games. Madoka Float gives you cards in hand. You'll also notice that Yuki Yuka also gives you cards in hands. The last one that I put in here, and you could use the other Yuki Yuka, the one that closes down 2 lanes if you wanted. I thought this one was more interesting and cheaper, which is one of the reasons why I run it, is that this has the ability to shut down an attack on your opponent's turn, and then if the opponent does not discard a card or pay an enter, you can pop it back into your hand. Now, the idea there being is actually kind of sneaky. It is pretty weak when you consider the fact that this is just shutting down 1 lane. Luckily, the game has slowed down a little bit, where the shutting down 1 lane might be enough for you. It's not impressive by any regards, but if they end up discarding a card or paying that enter, it leaves a window open for Aya's once a game ability to come in and actually manage to pull it off pretty easily. So, and if they don't do that and they leave it open because of fearing Aya's ability, well, then you get to be able to shut something down a little later down the line. It's basically like a free guard or whatever, and that's pretty good, you know? The ability to filter your hand and also just get so many cards, just raw value off your assist line, and then let's not forget Summer Lives Blues, means that you're never running out of cards. There's other cards in the main deck that draw you cards, but realistically, these are just like, you just are always having access to cards on your turn, and you're imploring your opponent to never have access to enter or cards in their hand on your turn as well. You can't stop them necessarily from having cards on their turn, but this is something that you can do in the meantime. The last one is Can't Stop Pretty. Aside from having, the Aya theme going, I actually like Can't Stop Pretty in these tempo decks, or these what do you call it? These Death and Taxes decks. It's just a really cheap way to kind of make up access to the fact that we're not running clap. You're able to run something else here that's a little more tempo based, and also get yourself a little bit more long game, time here. So I like Can't Stop Pretty here. The next thing that we've got here is, let's go over the actual main deck itself. So the real base of the deck is these Monomins and the Skrilla's Azure Evils. Now, Skrilla's Azure Evils is one of these new cards that's coming out. Its auto ability is when this Signy attacks, your opponent discards 1 card from their hand, and its enter ability is discard a card from your own hand. Discarding a card from your own hand is actually kind of nice here, in case that you're running things like, Parallute here. Parallute has an ability that plays with that. We'll go into that in a second. But more importantly, you're diversifying when you are snapping cards out of your opponent's hand. You are using Monomin to snap cards out of your opponent's hand during the main phase. If they Xenocluster, cool, your Scrylid, I can't speak, will do it on attack, and then Aya will also strip another one on attack, so that way their Xenocluster ends up being not so great anyways. Not to mention we've got some other ones here, Bruno, that also does it on attack. And a new card here, which I cannot pronounce this name, but it's one of the angels. Go ahead and comment down below how to pronounce it. This has the ability of, when an angel Signy on your field attacks, discard 1 card from your opponent's hand at random. Yeah, it's got some other abilities too here. When an angel is put into your field, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card from your hand. It stacks nicely with a couple other angels that we have here, but more importantly, it just is, that's not the thing that we're caring about triggering. We're caring about the discarding on the attack phase here. So we're diversifying when our discard happens, and that ends up being really nice for us. It makes this deck harder to Xenocluster out of the game. Um, but the basis here is with 4 Monomin and 2 Skralias. This 6 means that you're pretty much always going to be guaranteeing that you have one on turn 2 and turn 1. Sometimes 2, immediately. And that is really, really nice to enable yourself like a very solid foundation of tempo discard. Ending up our level 1s here, we've also got 2 Yukis. I've really come to like just 2 Yukis in the main deck, 2 to 3, just to shut down random abilities on your attack phase in case you need to get rid of some kind of Signy. Atoms is one that comes to mind. But also Remember is another one that comes to mind. We've got Servants, of course, but then the last thing I put in here is Georgia's Natural Element here. These have just the life burst of draw 2 cards, your opponent discards 1 card from your hand. You'll find that a lot of people are divisive on these types of life burst, especially outside of Atoms. They'll argue this does nothing on the board, therefore it's not that good. The answer to that, I think, is, and you could make that argument here too, because the deck really does not do much on the board, main deck specifically. How is it opening holes to win if you're not doing that with your life bursts? How are you depriving damage to make sure that you can win a longer game if you're not doing that in your life burst? And these are very good observations. I think the deck really thrives its best when it really deprives your opponent of being able to do much on their turn, just turbo discarding them. And this helps. This also helps specifically in the matchups where your opponent's trying to discard you. In those matchups, hitting one of these can undo an entire version of, like, entire two or three turns of what they've been working to. And by doing that, you just start winning the race, right? There have been times where I've been playing this in Atoms against other turbo discard decks, and I hit one of these in my life burst, and I am now distinctly winning the game because they've spent so much tempo trying to screw my hand. I now have cards in my hand, and they have no cards in their hand, and it just swings the game in my favor. So this is not to help you advance on the board, but it is to help you advance in terms of resources, and that's what this deck really preys on, is the decks that are looking to gain resources long term. This is sort of a meta buster in that fact. So you want to run some of these in your thing. And the last one that we're running is a new card, which allows you to discard a card from your hand at the end of your turn, enter charge 1. Its life burst also is draw 2 cards and enter charge. So this deck needs a little bit of enter just to justify break. And it only needs a little bit more. So I only put 2 of these in there, although I've seen some decks in Japan run 3, even 4 of these. I actually think this card's pretty okay. And the reason why you're like, yeah, I'm okay with trading a card in my hand for an enter, which generally speaking, I'm not. I'm usually wanting at least 2 enter out of using a card in my hand, is because there's so many discard decks that this is actually really good anti-tech against them. Like I said, this deck is a little bit of an anti-meta deck. You play this against the decks, like the aggro decks are going to fill you with enter. You don't have to worry about playing this with them. That's when you need your resources. But when you don't need your resources is going to be against decks that are discarding you. And this is another way to get around that, right? You have 1 card in hand at the end of your turn. They're going to spend an enter to discard your card, or just a Bruno to discard your card anyways. Well, you might as well get an enter out of that. Now you're depriving them of a card to play, which is virtual discard. But you are also being able to keep a card and convert it into enter on your end. And that's really where this card shines, and that's kind of why I like it as a small... It's only a 2 of, and I'm going on about it, but I think that's where this card can really shine in this type of deck. Moving on to our level 2s, we really only have 1 in here, which is that we've got Brunos. Yeah, I've got another one in here as well, but we've got 4 Brunos. Bruno's still the best blue discard that you can come. I've actually come to like Bruno's better than random drains, which is saying something in some of the top end level 3 stuff. I think Bruno's just like really solid. They fill out your 2 slot that you want and are that bridge between I want a level 2 that's functionality and gives me resources, and I want a level 2 with good life burst. And speaking of a level 2 with good life burst, that's where we've got this other angel. This is the only other angel in the deck, I believe, aside from our level 3. Having 6 of it means that you can occasionally pop off that twice per turn auto ability of being able to draw a card, discard a card with this, which is nice specifically for Parallute a little later down that we're going to talk about. But realistically, this is just another way to use coins. So the thing that I debated about with this deck is you get 5 coins. Realistically, you will only be using 4 of those 5 coins in the deck unless I put in some kind of sink to eat up the extra coin. And I thought about doing that with the one that is a bet spell, but I didn't really feel that I needed it. I was also pretty tight on life bursts already that I wanted. So you could replace these with that. I kind of liked the fact that I just needed a little bit more level 2 Signies, and this fits the bill, and it also works with the other angel here. If I wasn't running this, I probably would cut this and run the bet. I think it's called recovery. Yeah, recovery card instead of this, just to help filter my hand a little better. But I like this, and the ability is actually pretty good here. You pay a coin, and you can target a Signy on your opponent's field with 8,000 or lower, and put it in the bottom of their deck. Again, Enter Deprival is something that we're actively looking for here. You'll notice that everything I've done here is Enter Deprival. Even the plant, in a weird way, is Enter Deprival because it's just not allowing your opponent's resources to use. So I liked this to cover up our level 2 slot here. And that's just that extra coin, right? That 5th coin that you occasionally use. You're not always going to use it. Most of the games you're going to use 4 coins. Sometimes you'll have this, and this will be the 5th coin that you use. I don't have 4 because I didn't want to risk running into this being like, oh, this is actually coin number 2 and number 3, and then being screwed when I want to play the Parallute coin stuff. Now, Parallute, you pay 2 coins, your opponent discards a card from their hand. That's the main reason for it, right? We're just really basically levels 1 and onwards. We're like to our opponents, you will never have cards. You probably could cut one of these for something else if you really wanted to. I'm running the full 4 of these. I think it's pretty good. I considered running instead Firefly Squids, but I just didn't have enough self-discard to justify it. Something you should know is Manamin does not trigger that because it's not part of your effect, right? Like it's part of the cost, kind of. So it doesn't trigger the same way. The reason we're running this is because of the pay 2 coins. We also will get the ability of whenever a Signy is put into your field from anywhere, whenever your Signy is put into your field from anywhere other than your hand, you get to freeze something on your opponent's field and give it negative 2,000. That will only trigger if you trigger its other ability, which is when you discard a Signy from your hand during your main phase. You can put that Signy from the trash into the field. It's just another way to get yourself a little bit more bang for your buck when you're doing stuff like the Skirlias and the Hibiscuses, or what are they called. We also have Thrilling is another way to do it. I don't love it. I put Thrilling in as sort of this flex card. I guess if you really wanted this to be what is it called? Recover. You could do that, and it would be perfectly fine here instead of Thrilling. Actually, you couldn't do it because of the life burst. That's the issue I was having, was trying to find a non-life burst thing that I wanted to put in there. The Thrillings here is just to help you get a little bit more card draw if you absolutely need it. And sort of shuffle this from your hand, right? Draw 2 cards, discard a card, basically pays for itself, gets you a little bit more filler action here. Yeah, so you've got some ways to trigger it. It's not always going to be triggered, but it's something that I wanted to do specifically for the pay 2 coins. The deck wants to run pretty light on Enter, and between the random drains and the Elrig deck itself, we're pretty heavy on Enter usage. So I think this is a pretty good version of that, just because it's got the coins that you can spend. Following up with it, another one that I really like is Gay. I think it's called Blog. I don't know. It's just overperformed lately for me, and basically this is a white card, but really it's not. It's a white blue card. You need to be playing this in white blue, otherwise it's not a great card to be running, I don't think. it pairs incredibly well with discard. Basically, if your opponent starts trying to stash cards on the field instead of having them in their hand because you're a discard deck, this basically discards it from the field, right? So it's the way to counter that. It really, and this is kind of key into helping this deck long term open up lanes, is once your opponent starts running out of ways to refuel their hand, because they just don't have ways to refuel their hand naturally, then this comes in and sort of finishes them off and goes like, no, you will only be drawing two, you could fill your lanes twice a turn, and then you will end up having an open lane, and I will attack down that open lane. I think Aya is going to win a long game, specifically against decks that want to play long games. I think it's going to struggle to win against decks that want to play short games. And those are going to be its weaknesses, but we're leaning into that because we're like, we shouldn't necessarily try to go 50% against the whole meta. At that point, we might as well build a control deck, and I don't think that's what Aya wants. I think Aya wants to be a tempo deck pretty much overwhelmingly. And that is our main deck. The last thing to talk about is we have random drains. I ended up putting 4 in here. I don't think you always need to have 4. I think it probably could be 3 if you wanted to fit something else in here with a life burst, maybe flop out that thrilling to something else. Yeah, 4 is just the catch-all. I think there's probably a little too much discard in this deck when you look at it overall. You've got Parallute, you've got Bruno, full set of Miniman. So we've got this. Gaze also kind of count as discard, and then more discard here, as well as a discard here. I think the deck needs that amount of discard to function, though. I think that's its specialty, is basically saying I'm hyper discard, your opponent's never going to have anything, and then also being a tempo deck based on that, not necessarily a control deck. You're aggressively milling. You're aggressively getting rid of cards in their hand. They're going to have cards probably on their turn. You don't really care, though, because you can go long game if you need to. What you care about is that they don't have guards or cards on your turn. That's the big goal. So yeah. And remember, you can play Madoka Break offensively, too, if you need to. Right? Again, we said that you're going to ensure that your opponent will have no cards on their turn, or on your turn. So you can play this on main phase and open up 2 lanes with this while the opponent can't discard to do it. So that's the crux of the deck. I think it's actually pretty well balanced. I think it's pretty well stationed to be pretty good as a tempo-based deck. I put it in pretty high B tier. I don't know. Part of me thinks that's a little too high. But I am willing to see how other people who are better at tempo than I am take the deck and play with it and see what it's what it ends up doing with the wins. If you guys think it's pretty good, let me know in the comments down below.